This is Heather Greene, whiskey author and expert, and today we are going to talk about a one-celled, egg-shaped fungi super sugar eater. Did you get that? Otherwise known as yeast. And I talked a little bit about that last class, but I think it warrants more attention because yeast is a really great flavor maker in a whiskey. 20 billion yeast cells can make up about 1 gram or 1/28th of an ounce. So we're talking a microorganism here. And yeast reproduces by budding or fission. What you need to know though is that when yeast chomps on that sugar in the mash, two byproducts happen in our liquid. We get alcohol and we get our CO2. That process of eating the sugar, the yeast eating the sugar and releasing those byproducts, is called fermentation. And fermentation is obviously something we need in all of our spirits to create alcohol, in all of our wine and beer, actually, all of it. But really the process of fermentation and the type of yeast we use and how long we ferment and where we ferment and the temperature of the fermentation room and all of that kind of thing, all of those elements, are going to affect the flavor of your whiskey. If you remember, distillers must liberate the sugars out of their protective little shells, whether that be in the form of protected in the form of starch, or whether those sugars are inside a grape skin in which we want to crush that grape skin to release the sugars. So it's very, very specifically those beautiful sugars that the yeast are after. In the case of grapes, of course, it's glucose. Their lives literally depend on it. So each little yeast cell contains an enzyme, and that enzyme and the sugar molecules find each other and bond. Like basically it's like a lock and a key. That's the way it's described by many scientists. So imagine they find each other, they bond like a lock and key. And then in that process, what's released is exactly 2 CO2 molecules, 2 ethanol molecules, and heat. So if you were to approach a fermentation vat, what you'd find, well, first of all, you'd see it bubbling. That's all the CO2 being released, and you'd feel heat emanating over that fermentation vat. So this is a really complex chain of biological events that are happening inside that fermentation tank. Yeast is the same. So distillers are going to look for certain qualities in their yeast, namely its ability to convert sugars into alcohol. You really, really want that yeast to be able to do that. Not all yeast does it exactly the same. You want alcohol tolerance in your yeast. So a distiller wants a yeast strain that's going to tolerate alcohol. And then finally, you're looking for those fermentation flavors. Different yeasts really contribute to the development of different aromatics and molecular compounds that we're going to find in our whiskey ultimately at the end of the entire process. Even after maturation in a cask, we should still get some of those beautiful fermentation flavors in our liquid, and those are mainly in the form of esters. That's an umbrella term for the molecules which give a fruity essence to our beautiful whiskey. So those apples and those pears, 2 of those are great notes that we find and can attribute to partially to fermentation and that process. Other things that we get out of those fermentation flavors are some of the floral notes. We might find those in there. Some of those toasty, of course, malty notes, the interaction of the different grains and the maltiness of those grains during fermentation. All of that stuff is really exciting. It's an incredible biological process, a chain of reaction, as I said, of events that really are part of what makes your whiskey so beautiful. Yeast is also sensitive to different temperatures. The kinds of sugars that you're going to find inside your vat All of that stuff we're going to be considering when we make our whiskey. So temperature does matter depending on where you're creating your whiskey. That will also affect ultimately the flavor that's happening inside your fermentation of that, and then you see that followed through all the way to the end where you're drinking your whiskey. The alcohol content of fermented grain, agave, or sugarcane is about 12 to 15% in that vat. So once the yeast is finished eating the sugars in a spirit like those, we're about 12 to 15% alcohol. And in wine, it's about 5%. So not so much in wine. The yeast isn't doing the same kind of job as it is doing in our spirits. Yeast is very proprietary depending on the distillery. So many distilleries are protecting the type of yeast that they have. They don't want to change it. They may even store their yeast in different facilities. So if something happens in one place, they have some strains of that yeast somewhere else to protect it. So think of it as like the magic ingredient or the golden nugget. You change your yeast, you can change your entire flavor of your whiskey. So the next time you smell some of those beautiful fruity flavors, some of those florals, you can thank that beautiful little one-celled organism for doing its magic.